water source, industrial water source, food processing, and drinking water. On the other side, you have more of the natural ecosystem uses, natural waters, native aquatic life support, wildlife, recreation, and aesthetics. So I want to thank Terry for helping me with this slide, because I had the DOH version, which I had simplified several times, but it still had about 10,000 circles going on, because in reality, it's much more complex than this. But for tonight, we're going to simplify the regulatory programs to actions of monitor, assess, report, and take action to meet that goal of clean water. And why do we care about it? I'm going to use the example of coral reefs, because that's an ecosystem that a lot of people are concerned about. The coral reefs need clean, clear water to grow. So in the regulations, it specifically says for the waters here on the South Kihei coast that conservation of coral reefs is a protected, designated use. And so they need lack of pollution, and they also need temperatures that are appropriate, because most people don't realize that heat is also a pollutant. And that's one of the ways that the Clean Water Act addresses things like stream diversion. One of the problems with stream diversion is when your stream flow gets really low, or if you make a stream totally concrete instead of a natural system, that the water that is in there can heat up and be too hot for the fish. So heat is a pollutant, and it's regulated under the Clean Water Act. Other kinds of things that we're concerned about are nutrients, which we already talked about. Nitrogen is a nutrient, phosphorus is another one. You're going to hear about these same things from your gardening friends, because they're going to talk about how these nutrients work with plants. So when you learn about nitrogen and phosphorus, don't just think about how it works in your garden, but think what happens if it runs off in the stormwater or infiltrates through the groundwater and gets out onto the reef. Think how it's acting as a fertilizer out there. And these are some of the, we have not only nutrients, but pathogens, bacteria that cause disease. And this could be things that cause human diseases or coral diseases. Sediment, which we know smothers coral. Toxic contaminants, which we have hardly begun to address yet. But every chemical you use, or that any business on the island uses, goes to some sort of waste disposal, and much of it ends up in our water. And some of those include endocrine disruptors, pharmaceuticals that people ingest into their system, goes out into their waste, it's not removed in the treatment plant, and it can actually change the reproduction of aquatic organisms. It can cause them to change gender, it can disrupt their reproductive cycles. So it's a very serious and difficult to manage issue. Fortunately, here on Maui, some of the bigger issues that we have to manage are ones that there's well-established technologies for handling, and so like nitrogen, for instance. But once we handle the nitrogen, it's kind of like peeling an onion. We may find, once we get rid of the big overriding thing, that we may start to be able to see more subtle effects of our discharges. Debris, like the paper bags, and not only that, but debris that washes down the mountain. It can be scrap lumber or cut trees and things like that. And then thermal stress, or temperature, like we said earlier. And this is particularly, some of the things we don't want to see. This, I think most of you know what healthy coral looks like. It's standing up, and it's not all collapsed down on itself like this. But this is a complete collapse of the ecosystem here due to pollution. And the other thing we don't like to see is signs on the beach that say you can't swim here because there's too much bacteria. And so those are the kinds of things we're trying to avoid. And when you're talking about pollution, it's helpful sometimes to think of it in terms of point sources, which just means you can actually find and know exactly where it's coming from. And then we also have non-point sources, which are more, I think you have to hit it a couple of times on this one, which are more dispersed and diffused in the environment and a little harder to get a handle on. I'm working right now to try to, part of my research is to try to quantify how much nitrogen is coming from point sources versus non-point sources. And it's a lot easier to get a handle on a point source. So that sometimes comes out being a little unfair to the point sources in the regulatory and management programs. Or like, for instance, in the press, you might hear a lot these days about injection wells, and it might make you think that that's the only source of the problem because there's so much focus on it, but it's really just the one that we can get the easiest handle on. So keep in mind that when you hear about the injection wells, that that's just one part of the picture, and we want to keep in mind the overall picture of our system. So here's the different kinds of non-point sources: runoff and sedimentation. Urban runoff is a big one that our county is going to have to grapple with in the future. We are approaching the population level where we will have mandatory, federally required controls on our stormwater quality. So that's going to be a big thing for us to handle. Animal waste is another one, and here that includes feral ungulates in the upper watersheds as well as domesticated animals. And it also includes, by the way, your dog and your cat. So, and the feral cats. So all of this waste, if it's on the land, potentially can get into the water and bring pathogens and other pollutants with it. And of course, agricultural runoff is a big one. So what do we know about water quality in South Maui? Let's look at what the DOH, Department of Health, does. The Department of Health is the primary agency in Hawaii that's assigned the responsibilities under the Federal Clean Water Act. EPA delegates a lot of authority to the state of Hawaii Department of Health and gives them money to implement these programs. And then we'll look at what some of the sources are and talk about some of the concerns of citizens. So we talked about standards, and that the Clean Water Act establishes these standards, and we have state water quality standards. So, remember we said we do monitor, which is the testing, and then we assess. And what we're doing is assessing against the standard, and then we report to Congress about what we're doing. And if the report's not so good, if we're not meeting our goals, then there's actions we have to take. So the monitor part, these are the things that the Department of Health looks at. Enterococcus bacteria is the official standard, and they use a second indicator, Clostridium, to help distinguish sewage sources because we have apparently high levels of Enterococcus naturally in our soil, so it gets hard to tell a sewage source from a runoff source. So we use a second bacteria. They test for turbidity, pH, and temperature. Turbidity is like the clarity of the water, how much solids is in it. pH is really important to aquatic organisms in their regulation of their whole metabolism, as it is to you. You can't drink acid. You want to drink relatively neutral pH water around pH 7. And we also use visual assessments, and this is something that the whale sanctuary monitoring programs are doing. We're training volunteers to do this because visual assessment is very powerful. You can usually tell with your 5 senses whether you want to go swim in some water or not. I mean, there are some problems that are not visible, but some things are really obvious. And also they look at nutrients, like the different forms of nitrogen and phosphorus. So they have to report to Congress every 2 years. And that's a pretty rigid reporting schedule for any kind of government program. It's continually ongoing monitoring, assessment, and reporting. So this was the 2006 report. I've recently learned there will not be a 2008 report because DOH is behind schedule, and so they're going to roll that into their 2010 assessment. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but you may hear more about that in the future, and I might ask for people to contact the State Department of Health and tell them what you would like to see in that 2010 assessment and any concerns you have about them skipping an assessment. But the last reported assessment in 2006, they don't assess all the streams, and they don't test for all of those things that I showed you at every site because they don't have enough money to. So they get very limited data, and they have to make very big decisions on a little bit of data. So the total number of waters